everyone, it's Agnieszka Murdoch from 5 Minute Language. Welcome to 5 Minute Language, which is a place where I share with you my top tips on learning foreign languages effectively and independently. Make sure you subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. So today's video is another one in a series of Is X language difficult to learn? I've made similar videos about French, Spanish, German, and my intention is to continue the series. So this is the next one in the series. Is Japanese easy or difficult to learn? So like I say to you in all of these videos, everything is relative, and the main factor, one of the main factors that will determine whether or not you find a language difficult is what is your native language? How similar is it to the language you're learning? And another factor is, do you speak any other foreign languages already? If you do, then that might make learning the language a little bit easier. But today I'm going to cover the reasons why Japanese might be relatively easy to learn and the reasons why it might be relatively difficult to learn for you, regardless of your native language. So the first thing I'm going to say is Japanese is probably relatively difficult because of the kanji. So the kanji is one of the writing systems that Japanese uses. Japanese uses three main systems: Hiragana, Katakana, and Kanji. I've got separate videos about Hiragana and Katakana, so make sure you check them out. But Kanji is usually seen as the most challenging part of learning Japanese. Hiragana and Katakana, which are phonetic kind of syllabaries, are fairly easy to learn. You can learn them pretty quickly, probably in a couple of weeks, if you really devote a lot of time to it. Whereas Kanji is something that it will take you probably years to master. Let's not kid ourselves. It is tricky. It doesn't look like anything that we've seen before if we can only speak English, for example. So the challenge is reading it, writing it, pronouncing it. It's not clear how to pronounce it if you just look at it. It's not written in the same alphabet as English, for example. I don't speak Italian, but I know how to read it because I know the letters. Whereas Kanji, I have no idea how to say the symbols because I don't have any clues as to how to pronounce them. The next one is something I've already touched on, the different writing systems: Katakana, Hiragana, Kanji, then there's Romanji. How do you get your head around that? There's lots of different systems for writing things, and especially with Hiragana and Katakana, they're both phonetic alphabets and you can write pretty much everything using both of them. How do you know which words to write in which script, and how do you decide whether to use a kanji or whether to write it in hiragana? That is something that you might find challenging, especially if you've only learned sort of Romance languages, for example, before, which are quite straightforward in that there is one alphabet and you write everything using that one alphabet. So the third aspect that makes Japanese relatively difficult to learn is that speaking Japanese involves a completely different way of describing your reality. So you can't just take an English sentence and translate it word for word into Japanese. You can kind of do that with some languages. So for example, if you want to put together a sentence in Spanish and you don't really speak Spanish but you're on holiday there, you can take an English sentence and sort of translate it word for word, and the person will actually understand what you mean. Whereas with Japanese, you have to sort of construct the sentences from scratch. So you can't take an English sentence and just convert it to Japanese. You have to sort of understand that things are described slightly differently. Okay, the final thing I'm going to mention that makes Japanese relatively difficult to learn are the cultural differences. So the cultural differences are sort of part of the language, and the language is part of the cultural differences. So first of all, you will have all the different honorific terms. So you will address people differently using different language structures depending on where in the sort of hierarchy you are and where they are. So that is another kind of tricky thing, getting your head around the kind of social norms and social conventions and then adapting your language to that. It's not something that works in the same way as in French, for example, where we've got the polite forms and the informal forms. We have them in Polish and in German and in Spanish and many other languages. But in Japanese, it works in a completely different way, and you do need that level of cultural understanding to get it right. Okay, so let's now move on to why I'm really here, and I'm here to encourage you to learn new foreign languages, including Japanese. So I'm going to talk about why Japanese isn't really as difficult as you think. So these are some of the reasons. The first one is that there are no noun genders. So in a lot of languages, for example in French, when you're learning vocabulary, you have to remember what the gender of each noun is. So for example, a window is feminine, a painting is masculine. You have to remember those genders, whereas in Japanese that doesn't exist. So at least that is out of the way. You're just learning the words themselves and you don't have to remember anything else about them. The second big one is that there is a limited number of tenses in Japanese compared to many other languages. If you think about English, for example, I think the number of tenses in English is technically 16. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, if you're learning German or Spanish or French, then there are many different ways in which you can express the past, the present and the future, whereas in Japanese it's much more straightforward. The next one, which is also pretty easy, is that verbs don't have to agree with the subject. So what I mean by that is when you're learning a Romance language, French for example, then you have to know all the different verb forms depending on what the subject is. So for example, I go is different from you go and she goes, and we go and they go, and so on. So you have to learn several different forms for each verb, whereas in Japanese the verb doesn't have to agree with the subject, so you just learn one form. Okay, the next one is something that I've already touched on in the first section of this video, which is about the syllabaries, Katakana and Hiragana, which basically allow you to write things phonetically. They are actually very easy to learn, and if you use an app such as Memrise, for example, you will be able to master those two syllabaries very quickly. I think I remember doing them pretty much in each of them in one weekend, because there's a limited number of characters. There are certain ways in which you can memorize them quickly, certain techniques for that, and yeah, so that's a relatively sort of easy thing about Japanese. Okay, the next one is about kanji. I know I said already that kanji can be quite challenging to learn, but the good news is that the more kanji characters you know, the easier it is for you to work out what other kanjis mean, or how to say them. It can be very difficult, but actually the more you know, the easier it gets, so hang in there. So there are a lot of words in Japanese that actually come from English. They're almost like loan words, I suppose. So for example, the word hoteru, which means hotel, or jusu, which means juice. Excuse my pronunciation, it's not perfect, I know. But there are a lot of words like that that pretty much sound like English words, but they're just there's a vowel added here and there to make it sound Japanese. Okay, the next one is also a big one. Japanese is actually pretty easy to pronounce. There is only one way pretty much to pronounce every single syllable. Everything is pretty much made up of syllables with a vowel. There's only one sound which doesn't have a vowel. Other than that, all of them do. So for example, ko, to, do, and so on. And it's not a tonal language like Mandarin, for example, so you don't have to worry about the tones. You do have to worry about things like intonation and pronunciation, and there are certain words that are pronounced differently. So like the R sound, for example, is not like in English or in Polish or French. It's quite different. But in general, pronunciation is pretty straightforward and easy to master. So the final one is that you can often leave out subjects and objects in Japanese if they are clear from context. So you don't have to say every single word in a sentence like in English. So for example, in English, you have to say, I am going to school, rather than going to school, because if you don't say I am, it won't be clear from context who is going to school, what you're talking about exactly. So in languages like Polish, if you're Polish, you know that in Polish you can also leave out subject and object often when it's clear from context what it is that you're talking about. So if your native language has that kind of characteristic, then you will know what I'm talking about. But all in all, Every language is logical, and that's why it exists as a language. The whole point of language is that it is a set of rules, essentially, that people have agreed that make sense logically, and that's what makes languages possible for other people to learn. So that's essentially the bottom line. That's what I want to communicate to you, is that Japanese might sound like a challenging language, but there's a lot of rules and a lot of kind of things that make it relatively straightforward to learn. So if you're learning Japanese, good luck, and make sure that you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more tips on how to learn foreign languages. And I'll see you next time. Bye!